It should say I have sound. It says I have sound. Okay, it says I have sound, but for some reason it's not coming through, so all you're getting is my mouth. It should say I have sound. It says I have sound. Okay, so finally got to work. A few little technical issues made it a lot of fun. Okay, all right. It says I have sound, but for some reason it's not coming through, so all you're getting is my mouth. You can hear me now. All right. So, had a couple. Okay. So, finally got to work. All right. No more double sound. Okay, here we go. So, just broadcasting this out. It should be on YouTube, and you'll get it on. So hopefully this will all work. Sorry about that. I just had to change a couple codes since I'm doing it at home right now. And a couple things really quick just to review. I did assign that common sense. I just want you to read through it, underline examples of how it led to revolution, the desire for independence. It in many ways had more influence than the Declaration of Independence. It spoke to common people. It's just common sense. And a couple other things. Remember, I gave you the list for the exam. I talked about how to do a short ID. I'll talk about it again on Thursday. But short IDs, to my point of view, is the building block on how to write an essay. So hopefully that'll work for you. And I'm trying to think of anything else. I will collect these notes. So just on Wednesday, turn those in. I'll put the assignment up. I think I already did, but I will make sure. They are, by the way, trimming trees outside. So you might hear some sawing, adds to the excitement. And, please use PDFs. Please use PDFs. If you just take a picture with a JPEG or something like that, it slows it down so much. Remember on notes, I showed you how you could do that, but also I've sent links out many times, and I put it also on my webpage on how to make a PDF on your phone. It makes it so much easier. It doesn't bog down the system. And so I can grade a lot faster and get things back to you faster. So with that, remember next Tuesday, I'm probably going to have the test. We'll do it in class. All A-Day students will be there, so they'll have their laptops. B-Day, they must all log in. I will only offer the class at that class period, or the test at that class period. You have to log in, turn your camera on so I can see you, watch you take the test. We'll put you on the big screen so we can watch you focus. No, just please, you have to do that. It's a way we can get through this and take a test. All right, so we got through equality, equality under the law, equality of opportunity. That's the first part of the philosophy. The second part is, just a second. I have to put down that I am not available on Teams. Where's my mouse? I've still put myself as available. Now I got to put myself as busy. There we go. Wasn't that exciting? Not as exciting as I thought it would be. Okay, so talked about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Remember, that's independence, freedom of conscience, and go as far as your abilities take you, as long as you don't infringe on the rights of others. So we talked about the social contract, and this is right where I quit in most of the classes. And I talked about this social contract, and that is what people think is democracy. By the way, those are birds from Costa Rica that popped on your screen. That is the American view of what democracy is. It's not a true democracy, but what it means is that the people are ultimately sovereign. We think that today. And that came out of the Jacksonian era, and where we'll get to a very complicated politician named Andrew Jackson. So I went through that. Last thing, just to make sure we get, it is the duty of the people to pay attention. It is your duty. You have to maintain vigilance. Like, for example, if you ideally would do things like watch a presidential debate. And if you were to watch that debate last night, I feel your pain. I feel your pain. But we'll talk more about that. I'm going to go through this really quick. First period, I already got this, but it's the grievances, the history, and it goes through and lays out all the examples of how the king infringed on the rights of the people. And this is an example of demagoguery, playing on people's fear, an incredibly powerful way to gain advantage in politics. You play it that I will solve your fears, I will bring you security, and the king is a tyrant, and this is how. They blamed everything on the king, everything. And I'm not going to read through these, but I just gave you a list of the many things, and you read through this when you read through the Declaration of Independence. All the way from imposing taxes without our consent, cutting off our trade, depriving us of jury by trial. The bottom one, he excited domestic insurrections among us, endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, trying to describe them as inciting American Indian attacks, which, of course, is, sure, the British, especially after 1775, were encouraging the American Indians to attack the colonies because it would help them win their war. But American Indians were attacking the colonies because the colonists were taking their land. And this is a common way of doing it, to say that, hey, the American Indians aren't really, or they really don't have a complaint. Everything's peaceful, but outside of agitators. You will see that in the civil rights movement of the 1960s. The same exact thing. This always happens. Those in power will say this. So this is not a new thing. In the civil rights movement, people fighting desperately for equal rights. And in the South, for example, they'll say these were northern agitators. In fact, today, people fighting for judicial and law enforcement reform. And if you know anything about American history, and we will talk about this, there's real legitimate issues about law enforcement reform. And what do people say? It's outside agitators, or my favorite, organized anarchists, which is like saying a tall, short guy. But this has happened time after time. This is a common argument. But Royal Governor Lord Dunmore of Virginia, and I just thought that picture of him in his kilt just kind of made me laugh. But when he was trying to disarm the militia, and in fact, he'd have to run away in fear. Virginia is going to turn into a massive civil war between Continentals, which was colonial favoring militia, and Loyalist militia. The Civil War would rage all the way until 1783. But he offered freedom. He would free the slaves if they fight for the crown. And this is a picture of, and they actually called it in this weird kind of way, they would try to find an African name, so they called it the Ethiopian Brigade. Or Ethiopian Regiment, I'm sorry. But they offered him freedom. And this would infuriate Southerners. In fact, a lot of the reason big plantation owners would become sympathetic and even join the Patriot cause was because they wanted to keep their slavery. Once again, another one of the many contradictions. But let's get to this. I'm going to come back to this. Jefferson would blame this on the issue of slavery on the king. But I'm going to do it in class. At least when I have a few students, so I'm going to save this until Thursday. So we'll come back to that. And so out of this was created, we're not going to read through this, I put the terms up, but basically created this entity called the United States. It was never clear exactly what it was. It's going to take literally a second revolution called the Civil War to come up with the United States. But that's another story for down the road. They create this country, there's euphoria, and remember, on the 2nd, that's Independence Day, they all went. This document came out on the 4th. It was read over many of the colonies. That's why they saw it as July 4th for Independence Day. And then the British come back. Up here in Halifax, so you look in the northern corner of the map. Let me see if I can get this right. I know, I need a producer. I need a producer to handle all the things. But I'm pointing, yeah, there we go. Up in the upper corner. Imagine I'm pointing at it. Okay, it's just opposite when you look at it on the screen. Up in Halifax, the British were assembling one of the largest naval squadrons in history under General William Howe. In fact, his brother Admiral Howe was the head of the fleet. So this was truly a family affair. And they were going to bring eventually 30,000 troops. This is one of the biggest amphibious operations, arguably the biggest amphibious operation in British military history up to that time. Amphibious means an operation that would go from sea to a land invasion. And their plan was to attack, let's see if I get this right, and I'm pointing kind of at it, New York. Yeah, I thought about getting the green screen. I might have to set that up for next week. I got a green screen, and so I can do it and I can point. Actually, my light's pretty good. So with that, I'm looking out a window. That's why if I seem distracted, a squirrel might run by. But New York, the plan was to attack New York. Now, Washington knew he was going to be there. And Washington took his militia. And in fact, there were a few troops that had a relative training. But for the most part, they just picked up militia along the way. Most of the militia in Massachusetts stayed in around Boston or went back home and farmed. And so Washington, in a way, had to create a new army. And his army was 1/3 the size. But he knew the British were coming at New York. Spies, and he took at it logically. New York was right in the middle. At least in the middle of where the British thought the most patriots were, and that's in the Northeast, the New England and Mid-Atlantic states. So, in this area right here, so, at New York, General Howe landed at New York, and this is going to be at the end of July. I forgot to say that. July 1776. So the end of the July, going into August of 1775. So the euphoria of independence has now been replaced with the British are attacking, tied with Philadelphia for the largest town, but becoming the most important harbor town in the United States. I should add, New York City is basically just on Manhattan Island. There is a small area of Brooklyn, which is now part of New York City too. It used to be a separate borough. It's complex New York history until about the 1890s. But for the most part, Long Island, which half of it's not all people, but back then was a rugged, pretty, low mountains, pretty rocky area. And Washington decided to put his army there. Washington decided, I'm trying to get my pointer to work, but for some reason, I can't get it to work. Yeah, right there. So you can see kind of where my pointer is right here. Washington crossed over. Now you notice I said Long Island. It's an island. So Washington is taking about 9,000 of his troops, most of his forces, and putting them on an island where they could be cut off by British forces. And he laid his troops out, basically part of them right here and part of them right here on what's called Brooklyn Heights. And if you go to Brooklyn, now it's just all people, so you just kind of go up a hill and kind of go down this mound. But back then, it was a very rugged, rocky heights. Washington set his men here. Now, this was a foolish mistake. Washington would make this mistake time after time. He never really understood how to fight with large units. He had only fought militia actions, basically doing guerrilla actions. We talked about that at the Battle of Monongahela. And so Washington put his army here, but never protected his flanks. It's called hanging flanks. He would do this a couple different times and nearly lose the entire army. And what happened at the Battle of Brooklyn at the end of August of 1776 is General Howe outnumbering Washington's army 2-1. What happened is Howe landed on Staten Island and took 2/3 of his army to Long Island, seeing a golden opportunity. And what Howe did is he attacked the two main parts of Washington's line and then set 10,000 men, the same size as Washington's entire force, over what is called Jamaica Pass, which is now kind of the Jamaica region. It's called Jamaica of Brooklyn, or the Bronx, and then attack the flank. And this totally shocked Washington's forces. All he had to put was a few hundred men to hold these heights. All he had was a squadron of about 12 cavalry. It was a disaster. His men, mostly militia, saw the British coming on their side and did what militia always did, ran away. And they ran as fast as they could to a small little defensive line around the village of Brooklyn. And they were doomed. The only thing that saved Washington's army and the entire revolution, night. It got too late, and Howe stopped the attack. Now, looking back at it, Howe should have continued the attack. That was the exact right thing to do. But Howe decided, I'll finish him off in the morning. What's the hurry? This is a watercolor of the British getting ready to attack at Brooklyn Heights. But giving Washington a break. Washington had his men gather up every rowboat, big rowboats called whaleboats, and he had men from Rhode Island who were whalers, a whole entire regiment, so they knew how to row. These hardy men began to organize the boats. And, end of August, I forgot to click that. Washington is hanging flanks. So, all you need to know is Washington's hanging flank, end of August. Sorry, I forgot to click that. I was so busy watching my map. And so, a disastrous battle, that is a painting from it. And if you look at this picture right here then, Washington is stuck on Brooklyn Heights, and there is this thing called a river. Washington has to get across. The Royal Navy's the most powerful fleet in the world. All they had to do is stick a couple ships right here. A couple small ships, medium-sized ships called frigates. They're fast-moving vessels with anywhere from 10 to 20 cannon. They would have blown those rowboats out of the water. That's all they had to do. But instead, Admiral Howe of the Royal Navy thought, I don't know why I put the East E River, it's supposed to be the East River, was too rough. He looked at it as, it's too rough. It'd be too difficult to cross. So I changed that. The East River is, that's what they call, let's go back. The East River is what they call that area between, sorry, got a little camera issue here. The strait between Long Island and Manhattan Island. They call it the East River. On the other side is right, sorry about that. Here's Manhattan, New York. This is called the Hudson River. Here is the East River. And that is the strait between the islands. A couple ships could have ended the war right there. But instead, the Royal Navy thought it was too rough. And they were able to slip a few ships across. Sometimes you see this called the miracle of Kips Bay, even though Kips Bay is further up the coast. But this was a miracle. And there's a stamp from, 1951. Washington saved his army. A watercolor of Washington trying to get the men across. And that is, they call it the Battle of Long Island. This is shown after the fact with the British invading New York. There's no real battle. They were able to slip across a couple of ships. And this is the great what if in history. What if the Royal Navy would have put just a couple vessels there? That would have turned the entire course of the war. Washington's army would have been destroyed, and the odds are the revolution would have ended. And the Declaration of Independence would have been a little footnote in British history. And I could almost guarantee you there'd be no United States as we know it. It'd be a hodgepodge of smaller countries. I mean, it's the possibilities are endless. This is one of the most important turning points of the war. And Washington kind of learned a lesson that we got to get to right here. The differences between the two sides will become clear, the two combatants. Now we're going to make a column here. The British on one side, the Continentals on the other side. By the way, that's a picture of New York. Washington was able to escape, and then he immediately ran away. Got the heck out of New York City, and he planned to burn down the wharves, which ended up burning down much of the town. So that's what that picture shows right there. That's a British accent. You see the British troops arriving. So these are the advantages the British had. So let's go through these. The British had the greatest population. They had a strong government to organize people, so that's more men and to organize it. They had access to money, and they could get credit. banks and wealthy people would buy British bonds. Remember, we talked about bonds before, because the assumption were that the British would win. Next, they had the experienced Army and Navy. They had loyalist support. Remember, this is kind of like a civil war. American Indians would fight with the British. Ironically, remember after Pontiac's Rebellion. But they would fight with the British because the British might stop the expansion of the United States. Now, of course, we could guess. This is a fool's errand for the American Indians. Of course, the British were going to keep colonizing it. But in the short term, they fought with them. And lastly, slaves would be offered their freedom, which could undermine the Southern system, undermine the unity of the brand new United States. These were the advantages. If you just look at it on paper, with the money and credit, I didn't even put down industrial base. I mean, I could have put down so many things. If you just look at it on the surface, of course the British should have won. But wars aren't fought on numbers. Wars are political actions that countries must decide if it's worth it. Let's look at the example of the Continentals, soon to be considered the United States. So first off, Washington, as I mentioned before, tactically, on the battlefield, tactically, made mistake after mistake. Tactical, that is short term. Strategic, long-term plans. That's why I had you answer that in Zen. A conscious conspiracy is strategic, long-term plan. Tactical, short-term plan on the battlefield. They attack me on the left, I will hit them on the right. That's a tactical decision. Next, the British have a lot of enemies, aka the French. We talked about this, Treaty of Paris, 1763. Supply lines are shorter. The British got to bring supplies all the way over from Britain. While, at least for food, the Continental Army's right there. Next, they have a better cause, even though the cause is kind of confusing. Remember, half the population are neutral. They do have a cause, but this concept, the greater cause of equality, rights, and liberty will be superseded by the cause of, hey, they're attacking us, and I want to get rid of the tyrant. But cause is not enough to get you to take a musket ball in the face. I'm saying as blunt as I can, but it might get you to support it. Next, they're on the defensive. The British have got to attack them. The Continental Army know the home field. And then the two biggies. All these, look, all right, but they're not enough to overcome all the advantages the British had. Well, here's the biggie. Washington did not have to win. Washington did not have to conquer London. All Washington had to do was survive. Britain needs total victory, or the Continentals win. Washington at Long Island did not need to win that battle. Washington at Long Island had to survive. And that's why he's a great leader. Washington kept the army together, got to New York, and stayed in the fight. And that's the last thing. Stay in the fight. As long as they're in the fight. As long as they're in the fight, they can win. Now, I'm going to... I think I'm okay. Give me one sec. I'm back. Yes, I'm wearing sweats because I'm at home. All right. The British have got to win because, and put this down somewhere, eventually the British will go home. They're going to go home. If they stay in the fight. Now, they need supplies. That's why France was important, etc. But this is going to happen time after time as long as they stay in the fight. So we will see it in the United States, for example, in Vietnam. Those people who wanted one Vietnam, called the Viet Cong, they stayed in the fight. The U.S. who wanted two Vietnams, North and South Vietnam, the U.S. eventually would go home. We are seeing it right now in Afghanistan. The Soviets saw it in Afghanistan in the 1980s. We're seeing it in Afghanistan and Iraq. The United States is going home, and we are desperate just to say any kind of peace agreement so we could leave, and the people who are there are going to win. Iraq, exactly the same thing. In fact, we are threatening to evacuate our embassy right now because it's so unsafe. We're going to go home. It didn't work. We will leave. These wars are very difficult. Now, you might be thinking, what about American Indians? Weren't they fighting a similar war? Yes. The problem is their numbers were so low they couldn't survive. They were not unified. So they didn't have that cause per se. And there's something else really big. They just didn't have supplies. They ran out of food. They just didn't have the support. So it's really hard to win a battle like that. So remember this. Oh, almost forgot. Oh, one biggie. The Confederacy should have won. The United States should have been destroyed in the 1860s. They had all the advantages because all they had to do to survive. The North, the United States would have grew tired. I should add, Robert E. Lee made a lot of mistakes. So with that, let's get back to New York. So New York fell. And then in September, though, 1776, okay, the British retreated, or I want to say the Americans, but the Continentals, that's more appropriate. The Continentals retreated on Manhattan Island. Washington had maybe 9,000 men. And sorry, I need a producer, like I said. So, up near the top of that map, up near the top, you see the Harlem Heights, which is now the Harlem area of Manhattan. Great food. But there was a sharp battle there as Washington's rear guard is trying to escape. Washington's army fought better. He did not get his army destroyed. They bloodied the British nose and then pulled back. Yes, he left his flanks hanging in the air. In October, more in upstate New York, there's another battle at White Plains. Washington did not win, but he showed he could fight and retreated. But even then, his army was falling apart. New York was a disaster. The United States declared independence, and within 2 months, New York City, their most important harbor city, or arguably their most important harbor city, fell apart. Philadelphia is threatened. Overnight, it looked like the revolution is over. It is because of these battles that they went back and said, we got to sign that Declaration of Independence. If you meant it, now is the time to do it. And so with that, there we go. Sorry. So, this would become the lowest point. You see in the middle of this map, I got a point here. Yeah. All right, yeah. See in the middle, that's where White Plains is in upstate New York. Washington's army began to bleed away. Bleed away. They had to flee to New Jersey, and men were deserting every night. It is going into winter. That picture on the left, those are British soldiers at White Plains. On the right, that's Washington's retreat across New Jersey, and that's the attack on Fort Washington. Washington foolishly left a garrison there and was destroyed. We can't go into every detail about this. But Washington's army was bleeding away. He was running out of men. He was down to less. Okay. He went from about 12,000 to about 9,000, 7,000. When he got to New Jersey, he's about 5,000. And men were deserting every night. As winter hit, as they retreated across New Jersey, they were nearly out of men, out of supplies, no gear. This was the lowest point. In fact, back at Philadelphia, there was total panic. And those who remained for the Continental Congress when they met again that fall were talking about replacing George Washington. Ironically, one of them was John Adams, who wanted George Washington. And so, if you look at this map, they retreated across New Jersey. And there's Washington on the retreat. There's the British following them. But the British got complacent. To General Howe, the war is over. Winter has come in. There's no roads as he sees it in this, this savage wilderness. Let's wait till spring and knock the British or knock the colonists out. A foolish, foolish move. Because as the Washington retreated and got across the Delaware River right to here, his army was now down to about 2,000 men. The British, though, didn't follow aggressively, and that gave Washington a chance to set up winter camp and survive. Barely. They didn't have food. There were no supplies. The Continental Congress didn't have anything. They went out and would get food from the countryside, but there's not a lot of food there. And you go out and take food from farmers, you just made loyalists. This was a disaster for Washington, but the British stayed in their nice camps in New York City, and they put garrisons along the postal road, it was called, nothing more than basically wagon ruts, between New York City and the Delaware River. The road will eventually connect to Philadelphia. Notice how it's all in one line right here. There's a couple fords here at a place called Trenton. To the British point of view, Trenton was way out in the wilderness, and what they stuck there were mercenaries. These were called, we'll call them Hessians, just because kind of the Americanized version of them. They were from the German Principality of Hesse. And their prince, or king essentially, there was no Germany yet. There was a bunch of small little kingdoms. They were sold to the British. We call them mercenaries. Mercenaries are soldiers who work for money and have no cause. We've talked about mercenaries before. We'll come back to them. They're technically mercenaries right here at Trenton. Technically. But they're not really mercenaries. The soldiers were conscripted, what in the United States we call the draft, into the army of Hesse, and they had no control over this. They were ordered to go fight for the British. And as they saw, we're out in the raging wilderness with these people who speak a different language. They speak German. And here we have these Americans, and they hate each other. They don't communicate. Nobody likes an occupying army, especially if they speak a different language. And even loyalists in Trenton hated the Hessians. They're out in the middle of nowhere and miserable. I should add, some wore blue uniforms, some wore green uniforms. All they cared about was brightly colored uniforms. Remember the smoke? We talked about that. So they're here at Trenton, and they're miserable. Now, the German Christmas celebration, the British would have something like this, was basically a 12-day drunken mess. They would basically drink for 12 days. This was a clever bit by evangelical Christians way back 1,800 years ago to try to encourage people who were in the Roman Empire to join. They incorporated the Roman holiday of Saturnalia, which is right around the shortest day of the year. The idea is we survive winter, so it's right after the shortest day of the year. We're almost out of it to spring. They took this celebration and made that into Christmas because nobody was really sure about Christmas. It wasn't a very important religious holiday at all. Easter is the religious holiday. We'll come back to this because much of the modern police force would come out of this and slavery. What a history, huh? So they're not going to have their 12 days, but they promised the Haitians one day they could have this celebration. And so they brought wagons full of some actually German beer and schnapps, but also just basically whatever alcohol they could find. They loosely called grog. And they brought this to Trenton so they could just basically pour out all their frustrations and drink away on Christmas Day, the 25th. Washington has spies because there's patriots all over. And this was a real problem for the British. What do patriots look like? Exactly the same thing. The same as the loyalists look like. So they're sitting in Trenton, these patriot spies, and they hear about this and send word over to Washington, and it's a couple thousand men huddling in camps. Heck, they're down to about 1,500. They're losing 20 men a night in Washington's camp. And tell them the Hessians are going to have a Christmas celebration on Christmas Day. And they have barrels of alcohol. And Washington, the gambler he was, rolls the die. And he decides to attack. And right before he attacks, he reads a pamphlet from the great pamphleteer we mentioned him before, Thomas Paine. Thomas Paine did not want to give up. But independence was called, and it really looked like it might be over. Washington's army was gone. Washington's army had disappeared, and a lot of people who claimed to be patriots when times were good and the British had fled were now abandoning the cause. Many were turning over to loyalists. It looked over. And so, he would write The American Crisis. And this was to rally support. And it's very much it's very much in the same vein as Common Sense, speaking to regular people. Here is the pamphlet. And this is the same printing that Washington would get, and he would read to his troops before they crossed the Delaware and attack the British. Now, before we get to reading the American Crisis, I have to read one part of it. What day do you attack the British? They're going to be drinking all the 25th, the whole day. And so the thought was, okay, if they're attacking, they're going to be drunk on the 25th. Let's attack on the morning of the 26th. Does that make sense? So on the night, Christmas night, his men, most of them, they show them in that picture with uniforms. Most of them did not have uniforms at all. They had whatever clothes they had, a few blankets, were bitterly cold, it's freezing. It's just around 32 degrees, it's just that freezing point. And so he would read the American Crisis. And you can see it up on the screen. Washington read it to his soldiers. And it starts with one of the greatest beginnings, I would argue, in any pamphlet. It's so wonderful. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of his country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation. We have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. And it goes on to lay out why risk crossing the river, because if you fall in, you're dead. Attack. Most of them didn't have shoes. They knew it might fail. It was raining. It was cold, sleet. But what a great line. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. Those are the ones that when times are good, they're all with the cause. Yes, times are good. Things are great. But when things get bad, they run away. But the true heroes were those fighting right now. Those staying in Philadelphia. So Washington was telling his men, you're the true heroes. And don't forget it. It might have been enough to get him on the boat. What a great line. Summer soldier and the sunshine patriot. So they crossed the Delaware. Here's the famous painting of the crossing of the Delaware. This was actually done by a German artist 70 years later, 1848. And it was glorifying American independence as a way to try to get Germans to unify into one Germany. 1848 was the year of revolutions. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and there's lots of pictures of it. That's a picture I took. And great painting. Okay, Washington did not stand like this. He's not a lunatic in this whaleboat. But the same men, many of the same men who rowed them to safety at Brooklyn, rowed them across the Delaware. And when they got out, they started to march all night. In fact, they could follow the path of the march by the bloody footprints of the soldiers who didn't have shoes. Yet they made that march. Loyalists tried to go warn the Hessians, but they couldn't wake anybody up. They were all sleeping it off. And so on the 26th of December, they took them totally by surprise and attacked at Trenton and rolled in there. Not really an organized attack, but the Hessians could not get organized. Half of the Continental Army, half of Washington's men, their powder got wet and they couldn't even use it. But still, they attacked, surprised the Hessians as they tried to come out of their barns or wherever they were sleeping to try to get a little warmth, trying to get their uniforms on, and won the day. A huge war-changing victory. After defeat, after defeat, after defeat. Even when they fought better, it was still a defeat. Now a victory. Not a decisive victory at the end of the war, but we can fight and win. Oh, how do we get spies? I mentioned before. So, Hessians had spies. Sorry, I forgot. I put it a little bit wrong order. But, part of the problem with telling the story. And the British, when they heard about this, were furious. Absolutely furious. And they sent troops down as fast as they could. You can see it right here. They sent over 10,000 troops under one of their best generals, Lord Cornwallis, down this road to Trenton to try to punish the Americans after all. Howe roused from his slumber. Let's knock them out. And so with that, Oops. Give me 1 sec. We have an animation issue. So, yes, we have a technical issue. There we go. Okay. So let me go back. So they swept down to here. Washington actually crossed back the Delaware the day after the battle, but then came back. And people thought he was crazy. Why are you risking fighting on the wrong side of the Delaware River if Cornwallis catches you? Well, he had a plan. He remembered it from fighting in the French and Indian War. So he camped, you can see where my pointer is, south of Trenton. Cornwallis came down. Cornwallis came down by January 1st, was at Princeton and on his way to Trenton. When they got to Trenton, Cornwallis's plan was to attack Washington's army encamped south of Trenton. Now, normally I would do this on the board. That's why I'm a little bit discombobulated. Washington, the night before, Spies once again, heard that the British were going to attack, had all his men light campfires. So it looked like a normal night, and then they all marched away. The British attacked an empty campground in the morning. But while they're doing that, Washington had his men go and attack the rear guard at, you can see it right here, Princeton, on the January 3rd, 1870 or 1776 or 1777. I'm sorry. Somebody drove by, distracted me. 1777. They attacked the rear guard at Princeton. And this was a bloody, confusing battle at Princeton on the 3rd. Really confusing. There is a picture of it, and once again, they show the Continentals in blue, even though they didn't really have uniforms. Princeton is here. There was a main attack here, and, well, Washington was trying to outflank him, but his flank was hit. His men began to run away. It looked like Princeton was going to be a disaster. Washington mounted his horse, and that's supposed to be a painting of it, even though that's a Washington from the 1790s. Washington mounted his horse, waving his sword, ran back at the men and said, "Forward, men, don't rally. Follow me," and rallied the soldiers and beat back the exhausted British who were counterattacking. And when the British began to run away, Washington led from the front, screaming, "On with me, and it's a fox hunt, boys." And this turned the tide. The men adored Washington for risking himself. In fact, a musket ball went through his pant leg and one through his hat. And so also gave the feeling that he must be somehow ordained to lead this assault. And the British had to retreat, and Princeton fell. These two victories, small minor battles, because right after Princeton fell, Washington had to run away again. This is the picture of him at the Battle of Princeton, and this picture is hilariously kind of funny. Look at Washington's face. That's the Washington of 1793. It's really kind of creepy. But, we should add, then after Princeton, after the Battle of Princeton right here, Washington ran away. Ran away to a place called Morristown. So Cornwallis could not defeat him with his larger army. These were small battles, but they told the Patriots, they convinced the Patriots, we can win. We can win a battle. And this could turn the tide. And remember, the war is about showing you can survive. How do you survive? We fight. We win sometime, and we don't get beat. Decisive battle. Both will go into a miserable winter camp. The British now, many of them had to stay out in the hillsides of New Jersey. Morristown was a nightmare. But Trenton and Princeton, twin turning points of the war, arguably. Going to be some awful fighting to go. But before we get to that, just one thing real quick for the bell rings. The bell rings. What am I talking about? Before we end this. 1777, the British came up with a new strategy. And this strategy, they're going to try to cut New York in half. As you can see from the map on the screen, New York, along the Hudson and Lake Champlain, if they could take that along this line, that would cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So if they can take New York, New England is cut off, they'll wither on the vine, and then the revolution will die in the South. They figured there weren't very many patriots south of New York, especially in the Deep South, and many of the Southern plantation owners were originally turned off by that whole talk of equality. New England's where the rebels were, isolate them. So the plan was for General Howe in New York to go up the Hudson. He would go up the Hudson towards Albany. General Jonathan Burgoyne would invade from Canada along the traditional invasion route from Canada down Lake Champlain, meeting here in Albany. They would also attack from Lake Ontario as a flanking attack. We're not going to talk about that one, just the main element of it. Now, at Lake Champlain, the British originally tried to capture Lake Champlain in 1776, but the New York militia built kind of an ad hoc fleet. They built this few ships, and they were able to hold at least part of Lake Champlain. So Burgoyne's got a longer distance to go. The guy who built that fleet and set that up was Benedict Arnold. Remember what I told you? Benedict Arnold's going to be one of the big heroes of the war at first. So that would split off New England, win the war. But General Howe and his brother are sitting there in New York, and they look at this plan and they say, that's a nice plan from London. We appreciate that. That's sweet. Good. Thank you. There's Howe. Thank you for that plan. I don't care. I have 30,000 men. We have the Royal Navy. The heck with it. And what they do instead is they go to Philadelphia. Without telling the British, and therefore Burgoyne, who's advancing to Albany. And remember, it's Canada. They can't really leave until July. There's a limited window. Continental Congress is in Philadelphia. He's got the Royal Navy. And so what they do is they sail with 20,000 men, leaving 10,000 in New York, sail up the Delaware River. Actually, I'm sorry. Sail up the Chesapeake Bay. A smaller force land goes up the Delaware, and advance overland towards Philadelphia. And that's the plan. Didn't tell anybody, advance to Philadelphia. And that shows the great advantage the British had, the Army and the Navy. Philadelphia would fall almost immediately. August 1777, the Battle of Brandywine, Washington, who, guessing they're going to Philadelphia, had his army, still mostly militia, try to stop the British before they got to Philadelphia. And at Brandywine, once again, he left his flanks hanging in air. Here's a watercolor British troops before the battle. Here's a picture of oil painting of the Continental Army. You can see one thing big about this one. It's they're in blue. They didn't have blue uniforms. They didn't have uniforms, except for like Washington, who was rich. Washington left his flanks in the air again and nearly lost his entire army. Had to retreat in disorder through Philadelphia, but he saved the army. But to Howe's chagrin, oops, I thought I forgot something. Go back, previous. They advanced into Philadelphia. The Continental Congress, and please, I did not put this on the slide. Last thing for today. The Continental Congress, they just fled. They went to the interior in York, Pennsylvania. They just fled. And the British took Philadelphia. The government moved to York. And it showed the problem the British had. Their army and navy, they could advance everywhere, but they couldn't hold everywhere. And sure, they could take Philadelphia, which they said that's the capital, that's where the Continental Congress is. But, And this is the big thing. But the Continental Congress survived. Washington survived. There'd be another battle at Germantown, and this time Washington almost won. Still lost, but almost won. And this gets us back to this big thing. Yet, here comes Burgoyne. And Burgoyne is now alone. And on that, we'll finish on Thursday. All right. So, sorry it was late. Sorry technical issues, and that left me a little bit discombobulated. I hope I figured it out. Weird things about this. And so with that, I have to leave. If there's no questions, please send me a note. I see a few of you have watched, but everybody's going to be responsible for this. I am making this an assignment. Get a little way to reward you for doing it.